A security breach warning pulsed through every floor of the neutral diplomatic station. But the source wasn't an enemy vessel or a weapons discharge. It was something far older, far quieter, and far more terrifying. A black ship that had entered orbit without registration, without signal, and without a single energy fluctuation that could be traced. The station's central chamber, lined with delegates from across the alien coalition, quickly dissolved into unrest as each species reacted in its own way. Whispers in harmonic frequencies sent pulses of alarm or flickers of bioluminescent skin, while at the heart of it all stood Commander Resk of the Varan Dominion, whose voice had brokered peace treaties that had held for decades. And beside him, the ever-measured scholar judge Elian of the Orathi, who rarely spoke unless it was to dismantle someone else's theory with unnerving precision. Their attention was locked on the viewing sphere where the black ship hovered, massive and motionless, absorbing all scans like a void stitched from ancient obsidian. And none of their pilots, no matter how genetically enhanced or cybernetically augmented, could enter it, as if the vessel itself had memory, and that memory refused them entry. "This is not a derelict," Elian finally said, his voice soft but cutting through the room like a scalpel. "It is listening, and it is choosing. Down in Sublevel 9, where the station kept its political liabilities and high-risk detainees, a human named Grant Hall paced the perimeter of his transparent cell, expression calm, but his thoughts sharp, layered, and constantly shifting like a chessboard he played. Only in his mind a former tactician from Earth's defunct Outer Peace Corps, convicted not for violence, but for violating alien trade ordinances that were designed to keep humans in economic chains. He had been waiting for a ship, any ship, something to use, but not like this, not something that tore into every alien protocol. Just by existing, something that made the high species of the galaxy feel small in their certainty. When the guards arrived, they did not speak, not because they were silent by nature, but because they did not know what to say to a prisoner who had just been selected by the ship that terrified their leaders. The black ship had refused Varen pilots, rejected Orathi empaths, ignored Kravari mind-singers, and even melted the neural links of 3 Tarseed navigators. But when the human's name was spoken near it, the vessel responded, not with a signal, not with a word, but with a slow, unmistakable shift of one outer panel, as if the ship had inhaled, "They want me to walk into that?" Grant muttered, more to himself than to the towering insectoid guard beside him. But there was no fear in his tone, only the measured interest of someone who had been underestimated for most of his life, and now suspected that something very old had finally noticed what the rest of the galaxy refused to see. No one had an explanation for why the ship had chosen him, not even Grant. But as he stepped into the docking bay, dressed in regulation gray, with a faint scar across his temple that never quite faded, even the most vocal alien leaders fell silent, not because of the human's status, but because the black ship opened for him with a whisper of motion that felt too deliberate to be mechanical and too ancient to be friendly. Asterisk. The restraints around Grant's wrists tightened as he entered the tribunal chamber, a hall of polished obsidian and suspended crystal that hovered weightlessly above a gravity core, built not for justice, but for political theater, and everyone in that room knew it, especially him. His escort consisted of 2 Tarseed enforcers, whose blank, mirrored helms gave no sense of thought or emotion, but Grant didn't need facial expressions to understand fear when he saw it in posture, the kind of fear that came not from him, but from the ship now tethered just outside the station, silent and patient, like a question that had already been asked. Waiting for the answer to arrive, Chancellor Ryvik of the Kravari leaned forward in her tall glass seat, her segmented mouth curling, as she addressed the human in a voice designed to soothe and unsettle at once. "You have no training in our systems, no authorization, no clearance, and yet the vessel recognized you. How do you explain that?" Grant tilted his head, not out of disrespect but calculation. his mind already unraveling the structure of the council, who spoke too soon, who deferred too often, who couldn't hide their contempt for humanity, and when he answered, his voice was calm but carried the slow weight of a man who had argued in war rooms and negotiated ceasefires with lives on the line. Maybe it didn't need to recognize me. Maybe it just needed someone who doesn't follow your rules. That answer drew a shift in the chamber, subtle but immediate, with Varen Commander Resk bristling while Scholar Judge Elian narrowed his pale eyes, studying Grant not with anger, but a growing interest that was somehow more dangerous. They did not understand Earth's wars, Earth's diplomacy, Earth's quiet collapses and stubborn recoveries, but they understood enough to know this man was not a mistake in the system. He was a product of survival, of pushing back against stronger forces, not by resisting them outright, but by learning how they thought and folding around their weaknesses like water around stone. Some called for immediate containment. Others wanted to dissect the human's memories with psionic extractors, and a few even whispered that he should be offered command of the Black Ship to see how far it would go each argument, revealing more about their fear than their logic through it all. Grant remained still, speaking only when it served him, asking questions that exposed contradictions, never raising his voice, never begging for favor, only watching as the strongest coalition in the galaxy unraveled itself over one decision that none of them had control over anymore, because the ship had already chosen, and everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, was scrambling to decide whether that choice meant salvation or the beginning of something they couldn't control. The interior of the Black Ship was not built for comfort, nor for intimidation. It was built with intentions so refined that even silence felt like architecture. And when Grant stepped through the opening, he didn't feel like he was entering a machine. He felt like he was being read. The air shifted as if it carried weight, not pressure, but presence, and the walls seamless dark and impossibly smooth, rippled with faint traces of forgotten languages that moved only when he stopped trying to understand them, responding instead to instinct and rhythm, like the ship required something between logic and trust to open its secrets. He wasn't afraid, though he knew he should be, and that thought alone told him more about the ship than any sensor scan ever could. It wasn't testing for dominance. It was searching for alignment, and so he moved forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived interrogation cells and political betrayals by knowing when to speak and when to listen above him. In the Council's observation chamber, the alien leaders watched through a live neural feed, their specialists monitoring every heartbeat, every neural spike, every breath, and while most predicted rapid failure, some began to shift uncomfortably. As the human adapted in real time, navigating the interface not with expertise, but with recognition, as if some part of his thinking simply fit. "I am not convinced this is control," muttered Commander Resk, his claws tapping restlessly against his metal cuff. "Perhaps the ship is merely tolerating him until it finds something better." "No," Elian replied without looking away from the display. "It is responding. He is interpreting systems we cannot even define." Within the core chamber, Grant reached a central console. No, console was a poor word for something that bent space around itself, casting faint projections of ancient star maps, strange gravitational rhythms, and echoes of data too complex to grasp in a single glance. Yet somehow, his mind didn't reject. Ith placed his hand on the panel, not because he understood what it would do, but because he felt like it was asking him to. And when he did, the lights dimmed in acknowledgement, a subtle shift in tone humming through the ship like a welcome not meant for the ears. There was no dramatic pulse of energy, no declaration of command, just a feeling, unmistakable and quiet, that he had passed some threshold, and that he was now part of a process that had begun long before he was born, and would not stop just because the galaxy wasn't ready for it yet. The council chamber stank of restraint, the kind that simmered beneath ceremony, where every movement and silence served as a blade in a room full of veiled hostility, and the black ship's continued cooperation with the human was now tearing through the coalition's fragile unity like a hairline fracture spreading through crystal. Each species had gathered with urgency, some in hope, others in dread, but all with agendas sharpened by fear, not just of the ship, but of what it meant that a human, one of the galaxy's least trusted, had accomplished what none of their elite had managed, despite every advantage herein. Commander Resk spoke first, pounding a clawed fist onto the curved speaking stone with a sound like thunder beneath ice. The vessel is a weapon, and it has aligned with a criminal. This is not diplomacy. It is occupation. Across the chamber, veiled in his silver robes and cold rationality, Scholar Judge Olean countered in a tone that made most ambassadors lean forward. A weapon that acts without firing, chooses without error, and reveals history older than our maps. This is not an act of war. It is an invitation we are too proud to interpret. Arguments flared, alliances strained, and behind every voice was a calculation. Some saw the black ship as a tool to be seized, some as a relic to be feared, and others as a pivot that could either preserve the balance of power or shatter it forever, while Grant, now residing in the ship and interfacing daily, became the axis of every plan, every threat, and every whispered bargaining had no seat in the chamber, no ambassador's crest, yet his decisions, his movements, even his silences, had begun to guide the shape of debate, and he knew it. Grant chose his communications carefully, submitting brief messages through the ship's translation field, never offering more than what was needed, never reacting to provocation. But in each word he exposed the cracks in their unity, reminding them that fear alone was not leadership, and that the more they tried to contain him, the more they revealed their own limitations. Some began to see the human not as an interloper, but as a mirror one that showed the coalition exactly what it was when stripped of its pride. And now, behind closed halls and unrecorded meetings, factions formed not just for or against the ship, but for or against the idea that humanity, despite its low status, might now hold the key to something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten how to seek. Relevance born not from domination, but from adaptability, and the longer Grant stayed inside the ship, the more the truth became impossible to ignore. The warning came through 3 minutes before the first shot was fired, buried in a scrambled relay from a Crovari patrol ship that had been monitoring the outer edge of the asteroid belt, just long enough for the human to process, but far too late for diplomacy. Inside the black ship's command sphere, Grant watched as enemy signatures flickered into existence across the starfield projection, their trajectories precise, their weapon systems active, and their colors unmistakably tied to the rogue faction of the Tarsid Enclave, who had long argued that the ship belonged to no one, and if it couldn't be controlled, it had to be taken by force. Power up the veil, he said aloud, though he knew the ship didn't need vocal commands. It responded to intent, to direction born from resolve, and within moments, the outer hull shimmered with its strange defensive layer, not shields in the traditional sense, but a field that bent tracking data and confused targeting systems, making the ship feel like an illusion even when it was right in front of you. First barrage came in tight, disciplined volleys, rail pulses, and ion bursters meant to disable, not destroy, but Grant saw the trap hidden in their restraint, a tactic designed to corral him, push the ship into a corner of the field where asteroid debris would block escape routes and limit maneuverability. He didn't react with panic or fury, only the deep, focused calm that had once made him one of Earth's top tactical minds. Back when Earth still had seats in war councils and fleets to send, and as the ship fed him incoming patterns and movement arcs, he began to calculate not just where to move, but where the enemy expected him to move. He didn't fight them like an alien commander would, because he wasn't trying to prove technological superiority. He used feints, Sudden acceleration changes, split-field echoes that made the ship appear. In 3 places at once, enfolded behind a rotating mass of debris, and used it to ricochet a low-energy feedback pulse that disrupted the pursuing ship's alignment nodes. The Tarsid vessels faltered, one drifting wide into the belt's gravity. Pockets. Another clipped by a fast-moving rock that Grant had manipulated into its path by triggering a microgravity shift at exactly the right time. He wasn't winning with firepower. He was winning by rewriting the rules of engagement in real time back. On the station, the Council watched in silence as the human, with no crew, no external commands, and no shared tactics with any known military, held off a trained assault squad with such precision that even Resk could only mutter, "He's not piloting that ship, he's becoming it." By the time the final Tarsid vessel disengaged and jumped into retreat, the black ship hovered untouched, not triumphant but resolute, and Grant stood at its helm, not with a smile, but with a slow breath, because every move he had made was a message not just to his enemies, but to everyone watching. You may be older, stronger, more advanced, but I can still outthink you. The ship changed course without warning, altering its trajectory with a grace that felt intentional, not random, and Grant felt the shift before the nav systems confirmed it deep in his chest. Like gravity had tilted sideways for just a second. He didn't ask where it was taking him, because he knew the ship wasn't dragging him somewhere for answers. It was inviting him to see something it had been waiting to show, something buried beneath layers of time and dust, far beyond the edge of the known charts, where abandoned colonies flickered out of memory and into myth. They arrived at a world shrouded in gray storms, its atmosphere thin but breathable, with massive stone structures rising like broken teeth from a cracked desert floor. And Grant stepped down from the ship alone, guided only by the faint pulsing of the black vessel's lights, which dimmed every time he looked back, as if urging him forward, not with command, but with trust. The ruins weren't lifeless. They were quiet in the way that libraries were quiet, filled with the kind of silence that held meaning. And as he stepped deeper into a chamber, lined with carvings and ancient energy conductors, walls responded to his presence, activating data streams written in a language he couldn't read, but somehow understood. In the center of it all stood a pedestal, and on it a single orb of shifting light, pulsing not with power, but with memory. And when he reached for it, the chamber responded not with alarms or resistance, but with vision. He saw glimpses of a civilization long gone, one that had not ruled through fear, but through stewardship, protectors of balance who had created the black ships not as weapons, but as sentinels, tools that could never be truly owned, only accepted by those who met one unbreakable condition. They had to choose a pilot with moral clarity, someone whose judgment wasn't shaped by greed, conquest, or ambition, but by a willingness to carry power without becoming it. And that's why the ship had rejected the others, not because they weren't strong enough, but because they wanted the ship for something, while Grant, for all his survival instincts and tactical brilliance, had never asked for control. He simply responded to the need. When the vision faded, Grant remained still for a long moment, breathing in dust and understanding, and for the first time, he realized the ship wasn't here to change the balance of power in the galaxy. It was here to remind the galaxy what balance even meant. The message was clear. Now the others had failed not because they were aliens, but because they were certain. The ship had chosen a human not because he was better, but because he still questioned what right he had to be chosen at all. The warning beacons from the frontier system were already lit when the black ship arrived, casting pulses of urgent red across empty space. And what awaited Grant beyond them wasn't a skirmish or an isolated raid. It was an armada, more than 30 ships, drawn from 4 major species and a half-dozen minor ones, had formed an uneasy alliance with a single goal: to destroy the black ship before its influence could spread. before it could challenge the existing order by proving that power didn't belong to the oldest or the wealthiest or the most technologically superior, but to whoever could carry it with purpose. Grant stood at the ship's core, the systems humming around him with heightened awareness, not fear, and he reached into the interface not to command it, but to listen, because he knew this wouldn't be a battle. He could win through force alone, not against numbers like these. Not without allies, he opened a broad-range signal and sent one transmission across the system, a message not laced with threats or posturing, but with clarity and choice, and it reached not just the enemy ships, but the outposts nearby, the Watchers, the human colonies tucked away in forgotten corners of space who had never been invited to these wars, only used to rebuild what was lost. "I'm not asking for you to fight," Grant said, his voice steady, his words carried raw through the void. "I'm asking if you're ready to stop watching others decide what you're worth." Some ignored him, some turned away, but not all. A cluster of older human freighters from a mining colony on Rhones Reach activated what few defenses they had and moved into formation beside him. Not because they were soldiers, but because they remembered what it meant to stand with someone who didn't lie to them. Two neutral vessels from the Orothi splinter sect, long dismissed as pacifists, answered next, broadcasting their support. Not as warriors, but as witnesses who would record whatever happened, to ensure no version of history could erase what was about to be done. The black ship expanded its defense field, covering not just itself, but the allies who joined it. And as the enemy fleet approached with coordinated precision, Grant didn't issue commands like a general. He asked questions, sent predictions, shared enemy formations, and let every ship around him decide how to act with the information he provided. And it worked not because he outgunned them, but because he adapted faster, used their formations against them, pulled asteroids into their firing lines, turned their overlapping fields into blind zones, and forced hesitation into their tactics. The one thing no fleet could afford when they believed they were unstoppable by the time the battle began to shift. It wasn't because the black ship was unstoppable. It was because the humans and their allies had refused to be invisible anymore, and those who had come to erase the ship found themselves staring at a truth none of them had prepared for. Weapon they feared wasn't the black ship, it was the people it had given a voice. The nebula churned around them like a living storm, streaked with volatile gases and magnetic interference so thick that even the enemy's long-range sensors began to falter. But the Armada kept pushing forward, driven by fear, by politics, by the growing realization that if they didn't stop the black ship now, they might never get another chance. Grant stood at the center of the command core, surrounded by projections of the battlefield in constant motion, enemy trajectories, shifting debris fields, energy signatures, and yet none of it was what made his hands shake slightly, what pulled his breath tighter in his chest. It was the choice he had known would come. The ship had revealed everything to him now, not just how to wield its full capabilities, but the cost of doing so, because this wasn't a war machine designed to devastate. This was a final measure, built to force decision, a vessel that could alter the structure of space itself to ensure survival, but only if the one in control understood what survival was truly worth. The ship's core presented the protocol, a clear sequence. He could activate a chain reaction that would disable or destroy the entire attacking fleet by triggering gravitational collapse zones within the nebula, using the enemy's own mass against them. But it would kill them all, even those who had hesitated, even those who were already beginning to retreat, and it would leave no room for the kind of future he had fought to prove humanity could shape. "I didn't come here to show that we could destroy everything," he said quietly, though the ship understood him even without words. "I came here to show that we could choose not to, instead of activating the protocol." Grant diverted power into the ship's subspace emitters, broadcasting a sequence across all channels, an open-source pattern of the black ship's defensive logic. A translation of its ethics, its selection parameters, everything he had learned. He gave it away, every species watching, even the ones still firing, received the same thing, the truth behind the ship's power, and the understanding that they had never been excluded by design, only by their refusal to meet the conditions required. That act stalled the battle. The Tarseed formation paused, the Kravari flagship, already wounded, stopped its charge, and one by one the attackers ceased fire, not because they were defeated, but because they had seen something they couldn't weaponize, an act of power restrained by principle. And a human who had been offered the most devastating choice in the galaxy, and had refused to take it for the sake of a future bigger than himself. The nebula began to calm, and in its fading storms, the black ship drifted in silence, not as a conqueror, not as a god, but as a reminder that true power was not in what the ship could do, but in what it would not do unless it had to. The diplomatic station had been rebuilt in haste, not just to replace what was lost, but to signal that the galaxy still believed in order, even if that order had been shaken to its core. And this time, there was no mistaking who the meeting was truly about. Grant entered the Grand Chamber not as a prisoner, not as an outlier, but as a recognized delegate with no species, no official rank, and no flag behind him. Yet every pair of eyes turned toward him with the weight of changed reality. The Veyron no longer met him with disdain, only caution, and even Chancellor Rivek, who had once declared humanity unfit for high diplomacy, kept her voice measured. When she spoke, "The black ship remains outside our control, and the protocols you revealed only prove that no species has exclusive claim to its legacy. So what, exactly, do you expect now?" Grant didn't answer right away, and that silence held more power than most declarations, because it wasn't a pause for effect. It was the space between question and truth, where fear usually crept in. But he let the fears sit there, unaddressed, until the others had to listen. "I don't expect anything," he finally said, his voice steady but without arrogance. "I came here to remind you that we were never asking for permission to be part of this galaxy. We've always been part of it, whether you noticed or not." Some of the delegates bristled, but others remained still, quietly absorbing what they had been forced to witness during the battle, during the broadcasts, during the weeks of unraveling assumptions that followed. The scholar Judge Elian stood next, calm as ever, his tone low but impossible to ignore. "You withheld the ship's full capabilities, even when you had reason to use them. Why?" Grant's gaze met his, not with challenge, but with clarity. "Because if we only use power to survive, we'll never deserve to shape anything beyond survival." That was the moment the room changed, not with cheers or formal consensus, but with the subtle shift of weight. When powerful beings begin to accept a truth they can't undo one by one. Representatives from species who had remained neutral, even silent, began to offer quiet nods of acknowledgement. Not yet alliance, but respect. And in that room of ancient traditions and layered politics, it was enough. In the final motion of the day, Earth was granted observer status in the Central Coalition, with a path to full recognition pending future conduct and cooperation. A formality? Yes, but one that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Grant walked out of that chamber, alone, the same way he had walked in. But now the silence behind him wasn't dismissal. It was the quiet that follows when the galaxy finally begins to listen to a voice it had refused to hear for far too long. The stars beyond the known sectors stretched wide and uncharted, scattered, like whispers of unfinished stories, waiting for someone to reach them, and the black ship moved through them not with urgency, but with certainty, its flight pattern smooth and deliberate. No longer evasive or defensive, but curious. Grant stood at the helm, no longer trying to understand every system or predict every behavior. He had stopped treating the ship like a puzzle and had started living with it like a partner, the kind you didn't need to command because it already understood where you stood and why you were still walking forward. The diplomatic channels had quieted, though not because interest had faded. If anything, the galaxy was watching more intently now, but the tone had changed, replaced with questions instead of accusations, invitations instead of commands. Some species still viewed him with suspicion, waiting for the black ship to turn violent, waiting for proof that this whole thing had just been another shift in dominance. But others, especially those living on the edges, on forgotten worlds and neglected moons, had begun to send messages. Personal ones, not to the coalition, but to Grant himself. As a mining crew on a collapsing colony asked for advice on shielding their settlement against rising radiation. A small Orathi commune requested access to the protocols he had shared during the battle, hoping to study them not as weapons, but as philosophy. And a group of human children on an orbital habitat sent a simple question carved into a plastic panel. What's out there? Grant kept that message on the wall behind the helm. He wasn't searching for treasure, or conquest, or lost civilizations anymore. He was searching for questions that no one else had dared to ask, and the ship responded to that search, guiding him to quiet places, old listening posts, and dead satellites that still carried flickers of languages long gone. He sent back what he found not always answers, sometimes just fragments, puzzles, stories waiting to be retold, and with every new system, every strange star, the legend of the black ship grew, not as a weapon, but as a signal that humanity, once dismissed, had chosen to explore, not with superiority, but with curiosity sharpened by struggle. And those watching rivals, allies, enemies began to understand something that couldn't be measured by scans or treaties. The galaxy had not given Grant Halley a place. He had carved one out, one star at a time. And now, whatever came next would begin with him.